I'm a big fan of art that challenges me. Art has made me very uncomfortable multiple times in my life. It has, I'm not necessarily sure whether I'd go so far as to say it's triggered me, but it has disturbed me before. It has made me like feel really sad. It has made me feel really angry. Like there's a whole sort of spectrum. And I think I'm a better person for having been challenged by uncomfortable art.
From mental health real talks to strategies that sell without the sleaze, this podcast is all about channeling your storytelling skills into marketing that works without losing your mind. Tell me about your week in books.
My weekend books. Okay, I gave a book a 2-star review and I really don't do this like ever. And I know that people have a lot of mixed feelings about giving bad reviews. I used to be a music critic. I got paid for giving reviews. It's just like it's in my blood at this point. When I read a book, I'm going to put at least a star rating on Goodreads if I don't put a full like written review. So anyway, that's what I do. So I'm on a bit of a Vari McFarlane kick this year. I don't know if you've come across her, but she kind of writes like rom-commy sort of sometimes dramedy kind of books. Really
What's
fun.
her
She's
name?
Scottish. There's a great Vari McFarlane. But here's the
Oh,
fun bit
yep.
because
I
she's
know who she is
Scottish.
actually.
MH is the V sound. So it's actually MHAIRI. So I was like, is it Mary McFarlane? No, it's Vari McFarlane. So I have read, I think, like 4 of her books in the last, I don't know, quarter. Anyway, I have a little gripe because I was kind of devastated last night. I finished You Belong With Me. And that's the sequel to Who's That Girl, which I loved. And Who's That Girl was just I was in love with a couple. It was so great. And then like You Belong With Me literally came out, I think, a month ago, less. And I was so excited because I literally just discovered the first one. So I was like, I get to read the sequel straight away. And it made me hate the couple that I fell in love with in the first book. And I was so devastated. And I think it was because it could have just been a bonus epilogue. People, I don't want to give any spoilers, but like Who's That Girl kind of ends on a bit of a cliffhanger. Like, you know who ends up with who, but there's not an on page kind of scene, as it were. And a lot of people were like, what we need more. We need to see it on page. And so I thought the story was going to go somewhere really cool, but it felt like a lot of manufactured drama. And I'd fallen in love with them so hard in the first book. It's the first time a sequel has really ruined the first book for me. I'm like, now they're so I'm still a massive fan of Vari McFarlane. Like she doesn't do much wrong. I'm still gonna read all of her books. But it was a sad week in books for me because I fell out of love with a couple that I'd fallen in love with. So that's that's my depressing start to the episode.
Oh, that's sad. I've actually only read one of her books ever,
Okay.
and I can't say that I've read it because I DNF'd it. I got it in London. I
Oh,
was
which
so
one?
excited because I only bought 5 books in London despite going to like 6 different bookstores. And then I was like,
Such restraint.
I hate it. I was like,
Okay,
I hate
which one?
it
Which one? I need
so
to
much.
know. Have I read it?
I think it's called like Mad About You or something like that, or
Yeah, I think you're right. I haven't read that one. I haven't read that one.
I could
But
not.
that's sad. That's sad. I hate DNFing. I especially hate DNFing fiction books. I don't know what it is, but it's the
Mm.
stories often haunt me. I'm better at DNFing now. Like life is too short, but I have books that I DNF'd like 10 years ago, and I'm still thinking about what happens at the end.
Oh,
But I
I
can't bring
feel
myself to finish
you.
it. But yeah, anyway, tell me about your weekend books. I hope it was better.
So, my weekend book, I mostly was like kind of an audiobook person this week. What did I
Nice.
finish? I was trying to remember what I finished. Oh, I finished Carly Fortune's new book.
Summer books coming up on my feed. And right now we're in the middle of Australian winter, and I just kind of hate you all for having warm weather because I mean I'm sitting here in my jacket. Australian houses are cold. I have seen, is it the summer
This
you
summer will
left?
be
No?
different, is what it's called. And I've decided
Ooh.
that if the world goes into disarray, which we never know in the United States what's going to happen and how much of a disarray it's going to go into, I will be living in Prince Edward's Island because this is the best aesthetically like location I've ever heard of for a book.
Amazing. Amazing.
And yeah, I mean, that's really what that book is all about for me. I gave it probably like a 4 star. I'm not sure that I really like her main characters.
Interesting. Were they like meant to be likable or were they meant to be unlikable and you just weren't a fan?
I mean, sometimes there's like this elitist thing that goes in her characters that I can't describe. Like, I just feel like they kind of think they're cool. I don't know. I don't know how to explain
Yeah,
it.
that gives me the ick for sure, for sure. Interesting. I love that it made you want to like just go to a location though. I'm trying to think if any books have done that for me. Probably any books that I've read about the UK, which is why I went on a massive rambling tour there last year. Just like I need to be here. I need to feel the atmosphere. That's what I want. Um, I love that. So would you read more of her books?
I probably would. I mean, I don't know if it was just this like main character that didn't kind of turn me off because I really liked the main man. Like he was very sweet and like felt like a real guy. Whereas like, when you read romance and the men just don't feel real.
I was just thinking, I was like, I really hate, actually, that's something, another criticism that I had for You Belong With Me is that a couple of the men in there made references to things that I'm just like, I don't want to be sexist. I don't want to assume that a guy is not going to make a Love Actually reference, but it was the type of reference he made. I was like, I've literally only heard women talk about that scene. Like, that's not, I feel like, and the thing was, the character wasn't set up as being obsessed with that film, right? So if that was the case, if they're just like obsessed with every scene in that film, fine, makes sense, whatever. But it was just like a very flippant thing. I was like, are we still talking? Yeah, maybe that makes me sexist, but I just like this doesn't gel for me. It doesn't check out in the world that I'm living in. But I appreciated the reference all the same because I'm pretty obsessed with that film myself. Um, shall we
Yeah.
talk about trigger warnings? Speaking of
Yeah, let's do it.
things that are annoying us in books. Uh yeah, go for it. I want to hear what you think about them because I feel like I've talked about them in Book Blurb Magic sort of till the cows come home and actually had a real go, not viral, but like get a lot more views than normal the one time that I talked about trigger warnings. So I want to hear what you think.
I think so I have mixed feelings. Like I think trigger warnings can be helpful, but at this point, are we just doing them for everything? I literally was reading a book the other week and they did one for like I can't remember. Let me see what my note says. They did it for like somebody having a broken arm. And I was like, are you kidding? Like, are we just putting trigger warnings on everything? Like, I know like that could be a traumatic experience. Like as a child, I fell off a horse and broke my arm. And it was a little traumatic, but like was it traumatic enough that
That
we really need to announce now that, like, that should be a trigger warning?
like if the broken arm was described in detail, then maybe I'd be like, ew. But I haven't read the book in question, but I agree with you that that seems overkill, and that's a word that actually makes a lot of people really uncomfortable because a lot of people feel very strongly about trigger warnings. And like you say, I think they can do a lot of good. I have a problem with the double standard that trad published authors rarely have to deal with any criticism for this. There's one book I can think of recently that had a bunch of trigger warnings added to, I think, the author website after a lot of people complained. And honestly, that was just a blurb and cover problem. Sorry, they didn't market the book properly. If they'd marketed the book properly, that would have been much less of an issue. But indie authors, I've just spoken to so many indie authors. I don't specialize in trigger warnings, but it comes up in the blurb audits and whatnot. They're like, do I need trigger warnings? And I'm like, you kind of have to decide that and maybe chat to your editor. If you've, depending on the content of your book, if you have a sensitivity reader, then maybe that's something that you can discuss with them. But I feel like there's this real fear from indie authors that the audience is just going to turn against them if they don't include them. And with that comes, I think that trigger warnings are kind of strayed from their real original purpose, which was warn people like readers of genuinely graphic, potentially disturbing material,
Mhm.
stuff that's going to really, really upset people. And I feel like now for indie authors, it's just to avoid giving offense, which is understandably really stressful because you can't possibly not offend everybody. That there's always going to be someone who's like, well, there was a broken arm in there and you didn't warn me. There was always going to be that person. And I feel really crappy, I guess, for the indie authors who are kind of freaking out over this and copping backlash for it because indie authors have a closer relationship with their readers generally. Like there's a direct line to you as an indie author in a way that I think trad published authors don't quite have. Even with the trad published book I'm thinking of, the publisher was the one that made the statement and was like, yep, sorry, here are the trigger warnings. Like the author wasn't on the front line of that. And I don't, do you agree with me? There's a double standard. Is this just something I'm seeing, or do you reckon it's a thing?
Think there is, in general, double standards between indie and traditionally published authors as a thing, but it's because kind of no one knows how to fight against that treatment.
Mm.
Um, I mean, I think it's hard because there's not like there's a like some sort of standards in traditional publishing. They're not wide open, if that makes
No, of
sense.
course not. Of course not.
So I think that makes it really hard for the rest of the publishing industry to know how to interact with the world because
Mm.
there are these rules that are unwritten.
Mm. Interesting. Are there any in particular you're thinking of? I'm so curious. If no, then fine. But I'm just like, oh,
I mean,
there's
also, like,
someone.
if we're thinking about, like, reviewers, like, there's unwritten rules there that we don't really talk about unless you are a PR person or are in the PR world in some respect, that, like, certain reviewers will only be talking about traditional publishers.
Yeah.
And, like, we all know it, but it's like, which ones are they? I don't know that indie authors know that because I hear a lot of the time from indie authors, "I would like to be on X," and it's like, that's not gonna happen. And when I say X, I don't mean
Mm.
Twitter, like, on whatever big.
I know what you mean. That's really interesting. So it's, yeah, about recognizing, I suppose, what avenues are actually open, and that's not always explicitly said.
Yeah.
I completely agree with you. I mean, it's as I say, like I used to be a paid music critic, and it's a funny world to be in because part of me, I have a lot of opinions about art. I was very happy to get paid to put those opinions out there, but then, a part of me was always kind of like, whoa, like this is someone's art that I've given 2-star reviews in a national paper for an album, and sometimes I'm sort of like, oh, that must have really sucked to be on the receiving end of that. And there's nothing vindictive on my part. I was paid to like evaluate this. Do other people want to listen to it for these reasons? And I actually think that, like, skilled arts criticism, there's a place for that, and I think it can be really helpful.
Mhm.
But it can also, those sort of unwritten rules can muddy the waters and make things really tricky. So I guess, yeah, it's really frustrating, I think, to feel like there's start like a subtext, I guess, to what we're hearing about things. And look, I think we'll probably be seeing more trigger warnings on trad published books in the future because
Mhm.
we can see that self-publishing is driving certain trends. I think self-publishing is almost single-handedly responsible for the rise in first-person blurbs, for example. And whether or not you think that's a good thing, we'll leave that for another episode. But there's definitely an influence that is happening with self-published authors. It's like a knock-on effect. So I think we will see more trigger warnings in trad published books, but it's something that can feel really sort of, I think, scary for indie authors. Are there any, like, for you, is there any sort of advice that you would give authors who are sort of sitting here going, well, what trigger warnings do I put in my book?
I kind of think if it's in the DSM-5, it should be in your trigger warning part if you are doing trigger warnings.
What
Um,
is the DFM-5? I'm clueless and fascinated.
it's essentially the diagnosis of mental illness, like, it's the way that them
Oh.
I don't know if that's, like, just an American association, so it might
Yeah, I'm like,
in
that
Australia.
might that might be a yeah, an international difference there, 'cause I'm pretty sure it's called something different here, but I'm not going to pretend to know what it is. Interesting. Okay, so sorry, can
So,
you
like,
expand on
if
that?
it
So you're
could
saying,
be diagnosable, it probably should be in your trigger warning. So, for instance, like, if there is alcoholism, that should probably be in your trigger warnings. If there
gotcha.
is, um, I mean, rape, that should be in your trigger
Yeah.
warning because anything that, like, somebody might actually who actually might have a mental illness of some sort
Mm,
could have should probably be in there.
mm. That's a really, that's a definitely, like, I think, a great place to start. And then you could always, if you feel really strongly about triggers for broken arms, like maybe that is something that's really traumatic for you and you're worried about someone else experiencing that, like that's also completely valid. And the really cool thing about self-publishing is you get to decide. If you decide that this is something that you would have loved a trigger warning for, then absolutely you can go ahead and put on it. But I think that's a really great starting point because I do think that authors sort of go, well, where do I start? And I tend to say discuss with your editor, because your editor will have looked at a lot of manuscripts and probably, it's not that they have all the final answers, but especially if they're specialized in a genre, they'll be able to probably at least tell you, well, most people put trigger warnings for this thing. And also, like I say, if you have sensitivity readers, then they're also going to be able to say, yeah,
Mhm.
this should be one. I think it's an interesting sort of conversation about our relationship with art as well, because I'm a big fan of art that challenges me. Art has made me very uncomfortable multiple times in my life. I'm not necessarily sure whether I'd go so far as to say it's triggered me, but it has disturbed me before. It has made me like feel really sad. It has made me feel really angry. Like there's a whole sort of spectrum. And I think I'm a better person for having been challenged by uncomfortable art, I guess. So I feel quite strongly about, especially as a kid, I think, reading books that I had no idea what they were about. And it's not that I read anything particularly inappropriate as a kid, but some of the books that I read, particularly through my teens, had increasingly heavier topics that I learnt a lot about, and, mental health and all that kind of stuff. And they had no trigger warnings.
Mhm.
And thankfully, I was in a place where that didn't cause me any serious distress. But I remember spending like an entire afternoon feeling really just like knocked about by a book, for example. And I actually really value those experiences because I think they taught me a lot, taught me a lot of kind of like, I don't know, empathy, stepping into somebody's shoes and really sort of feeling that with them. And I think it's it's a little bit confronting to me to think that we might have an art world where people never choose to be confronted by art. That said, if you're in a really vulnerable place, I also completely understand not being strong enough to engage with the art at that particular point in time. So it's absolutely nuanced, and I think it's definitely a good thing that we are talking about it. I think it's a great thing that trigger warnings are a thing at all, that people are even considering their audience that way, particularly if you look at the darker side of the romance genre where people are exploring quite, taboo or whatever sort of topics. And I feel like trigger warnings make it a safer space for people to kind of go, right, well, what am I actually getting into in terms of this thematic material? So I always, I'm personally not somebody who would look for trigger warnings. I would prefer to be surprised, but I'm also somebody who is mentally, physically in a position to kind of deal with whatever's thrown at me in a book. Aside from maybe like a whole lot of gore, I'd really like a heads up on that. That's not my thing. But also I'd just DNF. Like I'd be okay. So it's a really, I think it's a conversation that's often had with not enough nuance. You either get people who are very angry and like there should be trigger warnings on everything, or people who are really angry and being like, screw trigger warnings altogether. I don't want to ever use them. People should stop being such snowflakes. And I think in the mid ground there somewhere, there lies, a space for a really constructive
Mhm.
conversation that allows people to feel safe and comfortable consuming art. And perhaps maybe the benefit of that is that people can choose their challenges as well. Like I'm going to read something a bit more challenging this week and know what they're getting into.
Yeah, it's all a good point. I mean, I'm with you on like I want the hard things in some of my books. Like, but if I'm picking up like a Sarah Adams book, you better tell me that there is some rape acknowledged in that or something,
Yeah.
because like you're not expecting that from like a gooey, sweet book like that.
Yeah.
But I mean, like Sylvia Plath, they didn't have warnings back then, and The Bell Jar is like one of my favorite books in the world.
Mm,
Like such a good book. I
mm.
love that book. You all know now how dark
Yeah.
I am. Um, so I think
It's been
that's
on my
something.
TBR for the longest time. I really have to get around to it. But yeah, it's you're right. I think, but I also, my feeling with that is that also in some senses the marketing was a bit clearer. I
Mm,
feel like these days there's a real drive to just, I mean, a very soft sort of example with this would be Helen Hoang's latest book. I don't know if she's written one. The sad one. I think it's her third one. The Bride, not the Bride Principal, the
like
Heart
Bride
something.
Test.
No, the Heart Principal. That's right. I always get the Bride Test and like them like the Bride Principal. I always mix them all together. So I big fan of Helen Hoang, had read all of those books, but the thing was they marketed that Heart Principal one as the same fun,
Mm,
wouldn't necessarily go to say fluffy, but like that gooey, warm, sort of heartwarming kind of book as her first two books. And it wasn't a bad book, but it was so totally different in tone. I was like, I really wanted a heads up on this. And it wasn't anything that merited a trigger warning, which is why I say this is a soft sort of example. But the marketing kind of really I feel that a lot of readers aren't trusting book marketing these days, which is why things like Book Talk, I would posit as my thesis, is actually taking off because people want that word of mouth because they're just like, well, this just didn't either the blurb didn't tell me anything about the book or it said it was this and it was actually this. I think I actually feel really disappointed with the direction that book marketing is kind of headed in, at least from the trad publishers. I think there's just a lot of money grabbing in a way that's not actually serving readers. It's not actually building audiences. It's not actually building real fans. And so I think possibly that's, where trigger warnings have sort of started to arise from because people are getting too many rude shocks reading a book and going, well, why is this in the middle of my book?
Yeah. I mean, I could see that. I also think that it somewhat has to do with the book marketing world just being so much more vast than it used to be, and there being so much competition than there wasn't before, for instance, self-publishing and stuff like that. Like the world of when we were children versus now, like that book publishing world is totally different. So I think
Very
it's
different.
also partially that, but I also think it is partially that the world has become more almost divided. So stuff like trigger
Completely agree.
warnings can help unite us a little bit. Like at least it allows us to know that somebody cares at the beginning of a book.
Mm, mm. That's a really lovely way to look at it, I think, as well. I know that people have complained that trigger warnings are spoilers as well, which is the other kind of
Mm.
interesting thing. And I've, spoken to authors who are like, well, I kind of feel like this should be a trigger warning, but it spoils this, like if you're gonna
Yeah.
talk about death and there's no death in the whole book until like the end, people are going to be going, oh my God, like someone significant must disappear. Like it is going to spoil things to an extent. And I suppose it's weighing up, I guess, whether or not, you think that readers should have the choice for it to be spoiled. And I know a lot of people find it comforting to actually know the ending. I know people who Google the endings of the books that they read every time before they read it. I don't personally understand it. I get very distressed if I accidentally read a page ahead. I need to read the book fully in order. I need to be completely surprised by whatever happens at the end. But I know that for some people, it is just
Mhm.
a better experience for them if they know what's coming. So I think if you're an author who's worried about trigger warnings being spoilery, maybe that's not as big of a deal. Like if it were me and I was had a real issue with spoilers, I'd just be like, I'm not looking at the trigger warnings. Skip, skip, skip. So I do think people tend to treat trigger warnings like everyone is going to use them. And so if you disagree with them, then they're like, I don't want to put them in there at all. Or if you agree with them, there's like this kind of feeling that like everyone's going to use them. Actually, people have the opportunity to skip past trigger warnings. If I think they should be somewhere prominent, like front matter of your book, for example, so that people are less likely to skip past it, but or at least know that it's there is probably a better way of saying that. But a whole bunch of readers, like myself included, will just skip past the trigger warning. And I sort of take issue, I suppose, with people who kind of take this blanket approach of trigger warnings are all bad or trigger warnings are all good. I think the thing is, you look into your own kind of conscience and think, right, what feels right to warn people about in my book? What choices can I offer them so that they can have a better reading experience and leave it at that, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's at the end of the day, people need to read them if they want to and not if they don't want to. Like it's there for the people that need them. And like we need to remember that like that there are people in the world that aren't able to get the mental health support that they need and they need
Yeah.
things like that for themselves.
Yeah.